Good evening. I'm Tami Fitzgerald, the Executive Director of the North Carolina Values Coalition, and your host for another episode of the NC Values Voice. As you watch the program tonight, be sure to share it so your friends and family can watch with you. What a week this has been.
Under Phase 1 of Governor Cooper's reopening plan, churches can hold services of any size outside. Indoor gatherings are limited to 10 or fewer.
We don't want our churches to become hot spots.
But there has been pushback.
He will negotiate with NASCAR. He will negotiate with other people, but he failed to negotiate with us, so he's left us no alternative.
Saturday, a federal judge issued an order allowing indoor worship in North Carolina churches. This means that the state and local law enforcement cannot take any legal action against churches or those who hold services inside.
Digging deeper, Governor Cooper defended his order earlier this week, saying it's intended to keep people safe.
People are gathered together indoors and are closer to each other for more than 10 minutes. The virus has a significant chance to spread from one person to the next.
Governor Cooper says he will not appeal the court's decision. However, the full case will be heard in the next 2 weeks.
Days after the federal lawsuit was filed, the court questioned why Governor Cooper was treating retailers and ABC stores one way and houses of worship another way. Siding with church leaders, on Saturday, Judge Deaver issued an emergency 14-day restraining order, ruling all of Governor Cooper's executive orders restricting church worship services as unconstitutional. Talk about this important order and issues around the nation. I'd like to introduce this week's special guest and my great friend, Congressman Dan Bishop. Congressman Bishop is a licensed attorney and former member of the North Carolina General Assembly, both as a House member and a senator. He now represents North Carolina's 9th Congressional District, which runs from Charlotte to Fayetteville, and he joins us tonight from Washington, D.C. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you very much, Tami. I'm delighted to be with you. You know, this is a special opportunity for me because you and I forged a bond in some of the battles that we undertook together in Raleigh that is like no other. And so I've always had deep gratitude for your leadership and for the support and the instruction that you've given me along the way. And I value you as a very great friend of mine. And I feel the same way about the Values Coalition. Thank you so much for what you do.
I'm deeply honored by that, Dan. And I feel the same way about you. I am so delighted that we have you in Washington now leading our state and talking about some of the most important issues that we've had in our lifetime. So thank you for your friendship and your partnership as well.
Honored to be with you, honored to be here, and I don't think I would be had it not been for you.
Oh, well, I think you would. That's very kind, though. That's very kind. You know how cream always rises to the top. Well, for our viewers, Dan has a long history of bravely advocating for the issues of life, family, school choice, and religious liberty. And while serving in the state Senate last year, Congressman Bishop delivered a powerful stand for life on the floor of the North Carolina Senate shortly before he cast the deciding vote to override Governor Cooper's veto of the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act. It is an honor for me to say that we have him on the program tonight. Now, Dan, here in North Carolina, the frustration is growing over Governor Roy Cooper's slow reopen plans. What do you think about Judge Deaver's restraining order on Saturday?
You know, Tami, this coronavirus pandemic is not, as horrible as it is, it's not an unprecedented event. Not only did we have a pandemic in 1918 that everyone's heard of, the Spanish flu pandemic that killed 50 million people worldwide in a much smaller population, but in 1968-69, we had a relatively similar pandemic, and we've had other horrendous problems we've had to confront in our nation's history. So while this disease pandemic is not unprecedented, the public health and governmental reactions to it are unprecedented, and we're still in the midst of it across the country. And there are disturbing events that have been reported. Many of us have heard about them. And the frustration grows as people I think, are looking to emerge from this now, from these shutdowns, which are breathtaking assertions of power by very few individuals. And so there's much to hash out about the propriety of all of that, and also its legality. But you know, the most obvious and egregious impositions have been on the rights of people of faith. And you saw of course, the story from Kentucky with the drive-in service, where cops were out citing people and telling them it was criminal to be in the church parking lot, even in their own cars. And of course, although the district court refused relief there initially, but then the Sixth Circuit has granted an injunction saying appropriately that orders, you know, bans, flat bans on religious services that are more restrictive than say businesses that are considered essential cannot stand. They're an imposition. They're an unconstitutional trampling on rights of free exercise of religion. And so I was pleased to see, I mean, that happened in the Sixth Circuit case out from Kentucky. It happened, a federal judge, district court judge entered a TRO against a governor's order out in Kansas. And then I was thrilled to see the litigation come here, and Judge Devers' prompt reaction on Saturday, entering that order, allowing people of faith to exercise good judgment and to abide by no more restrictive law than is imposed on anyone else. That is core to our existence as an American people, and Judge Devers did a great job.
Well, I totally agree. And of course, we've been telling our coalition for a couple of weeks now that Executive Order 138 that the governor issued in early May is unconstitutional because it's an undue burden on religious exercise. And of course, you and I know as attorneys that states and governments can burden religious freedom, but they have to have a compelling state interest, which I think we would all agree that COVID virus is a compelling state interest in protecting the public safety, but they have to exercise their power in the least restrictive way, which courts generally have said means that the restrictions are applied broadly, that everyone has the same restriction. And what Cooper did in this order was he targeted religious groups and churches for having more restrictive behavior than he did businesses. And so it makes no sense at all that you can't go to church inside with more than 10 people gathered, but you could walk next door to the Walmart or the CVS pharmacy and have hundreds of people in the store, depending on the size of the store. And that just is an undue burden on religion, particularly. So we are emailing our coalition this evening about the order, explaining some of the legal ramifications of it. But I noted that Judge Devers cited the Kentucky case in his opinion. He also cited the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, right, which you and I know is the cake baker in Denver who was targeted by the local authorities there in Denver because he would not express a message in favor of same-sex wedding on a cake. And so it's great that we have some court precedents for our judges here in North Carolina to hang their hats on in coming to a solid conclusion that what Governor Cooper did was unconstitutional. Now, you know, under his leadership, Governor Cooper's, North Carolina is the slowest state in the Southeast to reopen. And I know you and I have had some conversations offline, but what do you think about his orders? And do you think he's exceeding his authority to keep us all under quarantine?
Well, you know, as I may have suggested even in the initial answer I gave, I do think that Governor Cooper lacked the authority he required to impose these orders in the first place. And he lacks the authority to maintain them now for even more reasons. So you know what, I think many people, most people probably agreed with the doing of it. I'm still not sure he had the legal authority to do it, but to do it in the beginning. But I think that consensus is rapidly failing. But it is particularly grating, I think, that he's the slowest of our peer states to reopen. North Carolina stands out like a sore thumb, as we did for many years with the highest tax rates in the Southeast, and a number of the changes that Republican leadership made in the years before I came to Raleigh and the years that I spent there, restoring discipline and try to make us competitive with peer states and so forth. But this, unfortunately, is very bad. We have Tennessee's reopened, South Carolina is getting reopened, Georgia is ahead, Florida, all managing a reopening process that is more rapid than North Carolina's. And what's interesting about that, of course, is that North Carolina's experience, every death is to be mourned, and every illness from COVID is troubling. But some of these things are part of life also, and North Carolina's experience has been among the least worst, if you will. It's hard to say best, but it's been fairly mild by comparison, and yet we are a laggard in reopening. You know, the media has been horrendous on subjects, and I think it's contributed to the problem. In Georgia, the governor there was Brian Kemp was one of the earliest to begin reopening, although they managed it carefully if you listen to him in some detail. And members of the media were talking about blood on his hands and things like that. But now they're eating their words because their experience in Georgia is going along pretty well.
Absolutely. Yes.
Every week that passes brings more economic devastation and isolation to North Carolinians, and makes it all that more probable that we'll have a hard time, recovering. You got over 1 million, I guess, who have filed unemployment claims. We have a grave responsibility, just as we have a responsibility to protect ourselves against this pandemic. We have a responsibility to protect our children and our grandchildren's opportunity for a livelihood and for prosperity. And we can do great damage if we do not restore normal operation of our economy promptly.
I was just listening to the news just prior to this interview, and I heard that there are 200,000 unemployment claims that are backlogged, and only half the people who have applied in North Carolina have actually started receiving benefits, which is just a travesty. But also, I heard Senator Berger, the leader of the state Senate, in a press conference stating that they were going to begin the legislative session with a deficit, which is the first time this has happened under Republican leadership. Democrats routinely ran deficits in the state budget, but Republicans have worked very hard to have a surplus of funds. And so the longer we stay shut down, the greater that deficit will grow, because we don't have the tax revenues to support the government. And that is keeping us all shut down, which is kind of a circular argument.
You get it on both ends, Tami, because as you say, the revenues won't come, but also the consumption of resources, particularly through unemployment. We built that $4 billion unemployment trust fund balance, and we're running through it. But I mean, it's an extraordinary asset for the state. We won't have to be in debt to the federal government to proceed. But you're right. Every week that passes compounds that problem.
Yes, and I think we could all agree that Governor Roy Cooper is not very good at managing emergency situations like a pandemic. His leadership seems to be poor, considering leadership from other governors around the country. But last Wednesday, we saw the Wisconsin Supreme Court struck down that state's stay-at-home orders, and the justices ruled that the governor exceeded authority to act unilaterally during the health emergency. Some of the arguments made in that opinion seem to be applicable to North Carolina, don't you think, Dan?
Well, I do. The court there made essentially the majority opinion had two rulings. One was that for the governor, for it actually was the state health director to exercise authority with these orders, shutting down, requiring people to stay in their homes, shutting down the restaurants and everything, that was that was required to comply with the Administrative Procedure Act. It was required to undergo a rulemaking process. You guys, folks who are even the non-lawyers on the phone and so forth, have heard of, you know, the regulations that are created by state and federal agencies have to be developed with a specific process, and it's a rulemaking process. And they said, yeah, that would apply to these orders of general applicability, and they were invalid because they didn't go through the APA rulemaking process. Now, that argument would apply in North Carolina, but it is of some questionable value because there is the ability of the governor governor's executive orders are subject to the Administrative Procedure Act in North Carolina, but for the governor, he could issue emergency or temporary rules under that. So he could go and fix the problem and reinstate it once he cleared up his problem. So that doesn't help us, I think, a great deal. The other thing the Wisconsin court decided, though, was specific to the statute there in Wisconsin, and it was that statute, although it was pretty sweeping, didn't provide anything like the breadth of power that had been assumed by state officials there. Now, that's not directly applicable because we're not dealing with exactly the same statute, but the principle certainly is. And one of the things that is interesting, and I've been working with some people, I will tell you, I think you are going to see within the next day or two, the filing of a lawsuit beyond the one that's already been filed here in North Carolina, because the governor's shutdown order for restaurants and bars, his shutdown order for personal grooming services like barbers and hairdressers, and that breathtaking assertion of authority that says stay in your homes except for what I permit you to do. All of those fall in in our statutory definition in North Carolina of quarantine and isolation. Quarantine is when you limit people's movements or actions based on reasonable suspicion that they've been exposed to an infectious disease. Isolation is when you confine them if you have reasonable basis to believe they've been infected. So exposed or infected, quarantine, isolation. Those statutes, the definitions there are fairly clearly encompass the scope of everything the governor has done. And those statutes say something pretty interesting. There's a number of things very interesting. One of them is that you can't have orders that have a duration longer than 30 days of that sort unless the governor, must actually state health director, goes to court, goes to superior court in the county to be affected. So that would be 100 counties in this instance, and gets the court's permission to continue that. And one of the things that's very interesting about what that statute also says, Tami, and it refers back to something you just talked about. When you were talking about impositions on religious freedom, you said that's a fundamental right, and the strict scrutiny that courts apply say you got to have a compelling governmental interest, and the means that you use to serve that compelling governmental interest have to be the least restrictive means on that right to achieve that compelling objective. Well, our statute on quarantine says something very similar. It says that you can't have an order that limits the movement or freedom of action of people unless it is the least restrictive means available to abate the public health hazard that we have. So the governor's orders are apparently in violation of the quarantine statute by virtue of how long they've extended and continue to extend, number one. And number two, they also, even if he were to go to a court and say, or if he were to turn a court proceeding at this point into an effort to show that his orders are appropriate, he'd have to explain how these orders are the least restrictive means available to serve the public health or abate the public health hazard. And since we don't have a threat to outstrip or overwhelm our hospital resources, probably can't make such a showing. Well, that's one of the reasons. There are many. I think you're getting ready to see litigation in at least one North Carolina county that's going to be directed to testing those issues.
Well, good, because what we've seen so far has been just an unabated executive authority exerted by a governor who really doesn't have the power to do it. And that's what I hear you saying. He does not have the statutory power to exert the kind of authority that he continues to exert.
We believe that's correct. He contends there's another statute that he contends he's able to operate under. It's called the Emergency Management Act. And I'll spare all the folks on the call maybe the tedium of hearing why that's not correct. But I will say one piece of that, and you may have heard the Lieutenant Governor refer to that along the way. The broader powers that exist under the Emergency Management Act, even those require the concurrence of the Council of State, who are the elected constitutional statewide officers like the Lieutenant Governor, the Treasurer, and so forth. And the governor never has obtained that concurrence, number one. Mm-hmm. But even if he had it, our view, based on established law, is that the more specific controlling statute is the quarantine and isolation statute. And whenever you have two statutes that may both apply to a situation and they appear to conflict, the one that more specifically covers it is the one that governs. So again, as we said, we think for a number of reasons, but certainly when you get into the heart of the quarantine and isolation statute, that the governor simply doesn't have the power to do what he's done. And as I said, I think we need to establish that. It needs to be established so that we know better what the rules of the road are moving forward. And as I said at the very outset, Tami, and I know you agree, this has been an unprecedented governmental response to a problem like this, and it poses all sorts of grave concerns for how our fundamental structure as a people and with rights functions, and it's going to need to be sorted out. And like Judge Devers' order on Saturday, this that is getting ready to happen is another step in the same direction.
Well, that is wonderful. One of the best phrases from Judge Devers' opinion, early in the opinion, was where he said that there is no pandemic exception in the U.S. Constitution or the First Amendment to the Constitution. And so what we're doing now in terms of allowing our executives to exercise so much power has the potential of creating a precedent that is set for any future emergencies that we have, whether it's a pandemic or a war or whatever it may be. And we want to make sure that we limit the executive power as the Constitution intends it to be limited and as our state laws do.
Exactly right. It's fundamental to maintaining the kind of people the American people are. It's just that simple.
It is. And, there were a number of groups that warned the governor about his overstep and his overreach with regard to churches and religious organizations. Ours was one of them. We sent out a press release and notified our coalition. And the Sheriff's Association sent a statement out saying the governor should repeal his order as it relates to churches. Obviously, it's not good optics for sheriffs to go around arresting preachers while they're preaching. And then the Council of State sent him a resolution that they passed, a majority of the members of the Council of State. And it's just a shame that it took pastors going to court to force him to back down on the order. Now, he has said he's not going to appeal that order. Obviously, it doesn't look good for him to appeal, going against a group of pastors that have clearly won with a big slapdown from a federal judge. And so I am hopeful that whatever lawsuit is getting ready to be filed will be as successful as the last one.
We hope so too. I do think in the case of the order entered by Judge Dever, voters always decide things on whatever bases they determine to be sufficient, and that's how it should be. But as for me, the fact that the governor was so willing to trample on First Amendment rights of free exercise and so recalcitrant at disregarding commentary and well-intentioned advice until he was forced out of his position by a federal court's order, ought to speak to who's qualified to be in office, in my judgment.
Well, I'll be happy to just say it clearly, Dan. We need a new governor. We need someone who cares about religious freedom and the rights that people have under the First Amendment. And Roy Cooper is not that man. Dan Forrest is. And I'm hopeful that people take note of this, that they will remember when they go to the polls in November that the governor we have now is the one that was so willing and recalcitrant, as you said, about taking away their religious freedom. So
and I'll do everything that I can to make sure people understand that's the case.
That's great. And thank you for being with us tonight. We really appreciate it.
I've enjoyed it. Thanks, Tammy.
Now, the weeks ahead will certainly be challenging for all of our leaders, the president, our state and national lawmakers, your pastor, and other local community leaders. Please remember to pray for them as they make difficult decisions to reopen our state and keep our communities safe. And please pray for Congressman Bishop as well. Now, I challenge you to remember your family's favorite local small business or restaurant and find a way to support them this week. As we work together to find a way through this time of uncertainty, your support is vital. If you enjoyed tonight's program, please be sure to visit ncvalues.org to watch past episodes of our program or support our work. I would like to personally invite each of you to join us in Raleigh on October 6th for a celebration of Carolina values. If your small business or church is interested in joining us as a sponsor, please visit ncvalues.org/celebration for more information. Thank you for joining us tonight. We will see you next Wednesday for another episode of the NC Values Voice. Good night.